Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa. Today I'm showing you 2 ways to make a layered tiered skirt for your dolls. These 2 methods theoretically should get similar results, but I will be comparing them at the end to see which one I like better. Option 1 starts with an A-line skirt as the base. If you're not familiar with them, A-line skirts are where the waist is smaller, in this case preferably the same size as the waist of the bodice, and then it flares out slightly at the hem, but not so wide that it's like a full circle skirt or anything like that. You could either use an existing A-line skirt pattern if you have one, or you could go ahead and draft out a quarter circle skirt. So cut that out and go ahead and sew the side seams if it has any, and hem the bottom edge. So now I have my base ready. I am doing 3 layers, so one will be attached right here at the top, one will be attached somewhere in this area, and then one will be attached somewhere around here. To determine the exact placement of those last 2 layers, I need to measure this center back seam. It's about 7 inches. And then I need to divide that by 3, which gives me 2 1/3 inch. And now I need to mark, measuring from the top down, 2 1/3 inches, and create a line there. I'm using a heat erase pen. This is all going to be covered up, so it really doesn't matter a whole lot. And to get my measurements relatively accurate, or at least the same for every round, I cut out a piece of cardstock to the size that I needed. This is a little wide of a piece of cardstock. It really didn't need to be this wide, but it's what I had. So once I have the initial dashes made, I just connect them as well as I can. So this is where the second layer will connect or be attached, and then the third layer just needs to be measured down from that. Now that I have these 2 lines marked, I can start on the ruffles. This has to be worked from the bottom up. So to start with, on the bottom, I need to measure the distance from this line to the hem, which should be about 2 1/3 inches, and mine turned out to be about 2 3/8. So I'm going to take that number and add 1/2 inch to that, which would make it 2 7/8, which is slightly less than 3 inches. That's my short measurement, so the short side of the rectangle that I'm going to cut. The second measurement is just the length of this white line. It doesn't have to be very precise. I'm just kind of pivoting the measuring tape along as I go, and I'm going to say it's about 12 1/2 inches, and then I'm going to multiply that by 2, which should give me 25 inches, and that will be the long measurement on the rectangle for this ruffle. Once you have your strip cut out, you're going to turn one of the long edges up 1/4 inch and hem it. Then you're going to finish the other long edge either with a serger or a zigzag stitch, and run a gathering thread along that same edge. So now I'm going to take this piece and line that top edge, the edge that's finished, up with the white line and pin it in place. I find it easiest to pin both ends and then the center of the strip to roughly the center of the panel. It doesn't have to be extremely precise or anything, it's just a little more helpful that way. Helps get more even gathers. Now take the gathering thread and pull it so that the skirt begins to gather up. Once it's pulled to about the proper width on one side, can tie a knot to kind of help keep it in place. And repeat for the other side. And then even out the gathers. And go ahead and pin them in place. Now sew along that gathered edge to attach the ruffle to the base. Here is the bottom layer attached. The middle and top layers are done the exact same way with one small change. So that is when you measure your distance for the short end, which is again 2 3/8. Instead of adding 1/2 inch, you're going to add 3/4 of an inch. So for me, that's 3 1/8 of an inch. That will be my short side for both of these next two tiers. And the long edge will once again be measured along the line or along top and doubled. And other than that small change in the cutting measurements, the assembly is the exact same. So you'll hem the bottom edge and finish the top edge, gather it, and attach it to the base. Now that the skirt panel is done, I can go ahead and attach it to the bodice. Now in theory, this A-line skirt should have been about the same size at the waist as the waist of the top. It is a little large, but not so much that I can't just kind of ease it in to place. If it was too large, I would just run another gathering stitch over this and kind of gather it in. It's really not a big deal. After attaching the skirt, I just finish the back openings, add Velcro, and sew down the last of the center back seam. And one thing that I did forget is that the long edge that gets gathered on that top layer actually did not need to be finished because it is being sewn to the bodice. So version 2 does require a bit more math. You're going to start by determining the length of your skirt, and you get that by measuring from the waist down to wherever you want it to fall. In my case, I want it to be floor length, so I'm going with 7 3/4 of an inch. So 7 3/4. So 7 3/4 is the lower ruffle length, and that's the finished length. It's not including seam allowances. I'll come back and add those in a minute. So then I also need to divide this by 3, which is approximately 2 5/8. So 2 5/8 is the top ruffle length. And I'm going to double that top ruffle length for the middle, 5 1/4 inches. So this is all done the length without seam allowance. Once again, we have to add that in. So this is partly going to depend on your pattern. So whatever the seam allowance is at the waist, you need to add that, and you also need to add however much you're going to tone up the hem. So I'm toning it up 1/4 of an inch at the hem, and my seam allowance is 3/16 of an inch or something like that. I'm just going to go ahead and round it up to 1/4 inch. So I'm adding 1/2 inch here on everything. So for this one to assemble, I do have to start with the top ruffle. So I need 3 1/8 of an inch tall, and then the width will be the waist of the bodice times 2. That's about 5 1/4 times 2 is 10 1/2. After cutting the first strip, I fold one of the long edges up 1/4 of an inch and hem it. Then gather the other long edge to the width of the bodice waist and attach it. And the way this version is going to work is that each layer is going to be attached at the waist in order to keep the bulk down, because if I just did 3 different layers at 3 different lengths, gathered them all up, and sewed them to the waist, this is going to get really thick and bulky really fast. So what I'm going to do instead is replace the top part of each of the next 2 tiers with tulle. And so what the tulle will do is it will be attached at the waist and stop a little before the end of the last layer's hem and then switch to whatever the next color is for the fabric. So for the tulle layer, the width is different from these fabric layers, it's not going to be twice the waist measurement, but it does need to be more than the waist measurement. Specifically, it needs to be wide enough to go around the doll's hips plus some seam allowance. For this Barbie, which is an original made to move Barbie, it's like 5¼ inches. Plus seam allowance and everything else, I'm rounding up to 6 inches, which conveniently is basically the width of this tool here. So I don't need to worry about cutting the width, which is nice. For the length, I am taking my dress where it's already sewn with the first layer, and I have it flipped up so that I can see that raw edge. Then I am measuring from the raw edges down to the hem of the first layer, and that is 2 7/8 of an inch. And that's how much I need to cut of my tool for the length. That is the tool part of the second layer. For the fabric, the width is going to either be the same as the first layer, which was 10½ inches, or I can double the width of the tool layer, which would be 12 inches. I don't think it will matter either way, but I will probably go with double the tool layer. We have to go back to doing math. For the length, I already know that my middle ruffle needs to be 5 3/4 of an inch. Now subtract out of that the 2 7/8 of an inch that the tool layer is, and we get 2 7/8. But that's not what we're going to cut the length to, because we also need to add seam allowance. Now this seam allowance, you're going to go ahead and do double of whatever seam allowance you're using. So I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance for this part, so I'm adding 1/2 inch to that. So that is 3 3/8. Therefore, that is how how tall this fabric layer will be. So 3 3/8 by 12. So what I'm doing here, and the reason I'm taking the time to explain it like this, is because while I'm giving you my measurements as examples, I'm really trying to get across how I'm coming to those measurements, because that will be more helpful to you, because unless you have the exact pattern that I am using, these measurements aren't necessarily that helpful, because it really varies by the doll and the pattern that you're using. Here's my 2 pieces for my second tier. And what I'm going to do is turn up one of these long edges and hem it. That's at 1/4 inch. Then I will gather the other long edge to the width of my tool and sew them together. Then I will gather the tool to the size of the waist of the bodice and sew it to that. So here it is after the second layer. And the third layer is done just like the second one, but I'm going to go over it one more time just in case anything wasn't clear before. So the width of the tool is the same as previously. The length is determined by measuring from this raw edge down to the finished edge of the blue on the second layer, which is 5 and I'm going to say 5 1/4. So the length of this piece, which was 5 1/4, gets subtracted from the total length of the lower ruffle, which is 8 1/4. So 8 1/4 minus 5 1/4 equals 3 inches. And then to that 3 inches, I'm adding 1/2 inch for seam allowance. So it will be 3 1/2 inches tall, and the width will be 12 inches, which is double my tool width. The remainder of the lower layer was sewn together the same as the middle layer. And then I finished the back opening at the top and attached Velcro. To sew the center back seam, I could just sew the entire seam all in one go, similar to what I did on the last one. But instead, I'm going to sew the center back seam of each layer individually. So starting with the first layer, I'm going to pull it up kind of like this, turn it, and then sew along this seam. And then I will repeat for the middle and then finally the last tier. Okay, so here here they are side by side, and obviously this is more about the shape of the skirt than really anything else. And I am actually kind of surprised because I really expected to like this one better, mainly because of the back, because with this one the skirt panels are loose, and so you know it gives more of a dimensional effect to it than say this one does, where because of how it's made they all had to be sewn shut, and it kind of, I think, flattens out the look. However, shape-wise, this one has more of that bell shape that, you know, starts narrower and just gets wider, whereas this one didn't get that. And that has to do with the A-line skirt base, because basically it's just already naturally wider down here, and you have more gathering on each layer. Now, I think this one probably came close almost up until this last layer where I did not, it's the same width as the layer above it, and I think that's what kind of messes it up, because this one here is slightly wider than this layer. So because of that, it does grow a little, whereas this last one just doesn't. Well, I was really surprised by those results, but let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching.